Well, hello and welcome to Beyond the Sermon, a Bethany podcast where we have the privilege of digging deeper into our Sunday messages. I am Tammy Delau, and today I'm joined with Pastor David Baxley and Pastor Steve Musto, and I am so excited to be back. I spent a week with my kids at a cabin, or almost a week. It was crazy. Social media makes it look magical.
Yeah.
The screaming kids, the lack of sleep, and the dirty dishes are not in the pictures.
They don't put that in.
They
never gets into social media, does it?
But it was super fun.
Yeah.
But I missed last week, David's worst day. The podcast with you and Kathy was wonderful. We were just talking about, we love how your girl adores you and how she looks at you.
Feeling is very mutual.
Yeah. So it's very fun.
You love how much she adores you too?
Yes, that for sure.
You're going to get me in trouble.
For sure that. But I know, because I did listen to your sermon, there is a part of this story with David and Bathsheba that really rocks our, that's not fair. What is God thinking? And so
I think there's probably more than one part. But I know
that is true.
The part you're referring to is glaring and glowing in the dark.
Right. And that is the part that an innocent child had to die for the sin of someone else.
Yeah.
And so you kind of had promised our body that we would touch that. So let's do it. Okay,
so let's start with a premise. And the premise is a little tricky for us, especially those of us who are Americans. And it goes like this. See, we have this belief that we have certain rights and we deserve. We deserve life. We deserve to have a chance at something. We deserve to get an opportunity. We deserve. And this is part of the human experience has sort of been built into us that we deserve all these things. So when you believe that you deserve something, like as a human being, you deserve to have the opportunity to choose whether you follow the Lord or not. It negates the idea that we actually don't deserve anything. Mm-hmm. That we are not good and then turn bad, that we are born into sin. And the fact that God puts up with anyone would be merciful. You know, if God chose 5 people out of the entirety of the earth, we go, wow, 5 sinners God chose. I mean, all of these people that just rebelled against him and pushed back on him. And these 5, we couldn't complain about that because God is holy, is what we talked about in the message. So if we start from that principle and we start with the idea that we actually don't all deserve, none of us deserves life. We don't deserve always to have good things happen to us. We don't deserve opportunity. We don't deserve. The reason why we have to start there is because it is so easy to see something in the Bible or something else and to say, that's not fair. And this is one of those stories where we say, well, that's not fair. This child had every right to live. This child had every right to, well, none of us has every right. God calls us into life. He calls us into existence. So that's the starting point. Let's start there.
And in that statement you're making, there's 2 words that we've created as synonyms that are not, and that is just and fair.
Yep.
And so some people would say, well, fine, but it still feels it's unjust. And they use fair and unjust interchangeably
as synonyms.
And God doesn't. And that's really what you're also building this foundation on is the difference between those 2 ideas.
Okay. All good and great. But how does one have that be the foundation of what they believe? I don't even know how to ask that question, but I have a friend who would say, Tammy, you don't deserve the breath that you just took. Right. So I had someone pounding that into my head, which was helpful, but that doesn't. It was helpful, but as when life doesn't seem fair, when things go wrong, but that's not something that the parenting classes teach you. You know, if you want to train up your children, let them know Does that make sense? Like, how do we do this as Christian parents and as Christian friends? And
it's a very different view of life. It's a very different view of belief.
Well, you can correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe it was my world at home, but actually most of the time kids complain that's not fair. And parents will often come back and say, I'm not trying to be fair.
Yeah.
Like there's almost a tension that as parents, when we get the complaint, that's not fair. We challenge that. At least maybe in my home it was.
I don't know if I agree, because I think parents try to be fair. You're going to make sure that you spend X amount of dollars on Christmas and there's X amount of gifts under the tree. And do you agree with what I think I see that?
Oh yeah. I think fairness has been elevated to a standard of,
well, I am grateful then
importance
that I did not grow up with that.
Okay.
Yeah. Like, but maybe I grew up as the oldest of 6. There's an impossibility.
Yeah.
It is an impossibility when I'm the oldest and there's a baby, for fairness to exist from a parental standpoint within the lives of kids, gifts, needs, all these things. So I've totally grew up with a very different worldview, even in parenting.
Fair is not a biblical value.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Justice is a biblical value.
Yes.
Fairness is not.
Yes.
And we don't get to decide what's fair and what's not. We don't get to decide what's just and what's not. That is up to God.
Okay.
And fairness, I would say as well, is always a moving target. So when you say, if you grew up in a family where everything had to be fair, I have talked to many, many people who are reaching either retirement age or moving towards the end of life. They're making end of life decisions and they want to split their estate amongst their kids. And they're like, well, we're just going to split it 3 ways. I had 3 kids, we're going to split it 3 ways. And I say, okay. I understand that. That's the impulse. Are all 3 going to do equally well with it? Oh no, one of them is completely off the rails, like a drug addict. As soon as they get money, they're going to be. I'm like, whoa! Why would you do that to them?
Yes.
Why? Well, you have to be fair. No, you don't.
That's right.
No, you don't have to be fair. That's a mistake. You're going to doom that kid. And so fairness is sort of a moving target.
Okay.
And justice is one of the attributes of God. God is just, and he's a perfect judge.
Okay, so then let's go back to the story of the baby with Bathsheba and David.
Yep.
Why was that baby giving his life or losing his life just?
So first, after we lay the foundation that God is just, but that we are not good, that we don't get to decide. This is God. What God did was right. What God did was wrong. That we don't get to decide that. The second thing is we have to, in the text, realize something, that the text never ascribes sin to Bathsheba, not one time. It just describes sin to David. This is David's judgment. This is not Bathsheba's judgment.
That's good.
Now, Bathsheba is going to pay a price, because anytime there is sin, you pay a price.
There's a ripple effect.
Absolutely. A dad sins, the kids in the family are going to pay some sort of price at some point, somewhere. The wife is going to pay a price. They didn't do it, but there's this ripple effect. There is the illustration that I had in my notes before I took it out because I didn't have time, was the illustration about a child born to a drug-addicted mother. This child didn't take drugs,
right,
but they're paying this price for the decision that their parent made. This is David's sin. There are a couple of possibilities about why this is allowed to happen. Why this child? And let's be clear, the text says that God strikes the child with illness. This illness doesn't happen and then God says, well, I'm just going to let it progress. God is the one who acts, and this child has an illness. So what do we know about atonement? What do we know about payment for sin? We know that in order to pay for sin, there has to be one thing. Death. There has to be death. So when David says, I have sinned against Yahweh, those 2 words in Hebrew, what is the reply from Nathan? God has taken away your sin and you aren't going to die. David didn't say anything about dying.
Yeah.
But the penalty for murder and for, assault, adultery, whatever you want to call this, is death.
So in the law, David would have known that
100%.
2 plus 2 equals 4. That equals death. Okay.
So the first thing that Nathan says is, God has taken death away. In Hebrew, it's a curious phrase. God has removed your sin from you and taken it to a different place or to a different one. So there are some scholars who say that God allowed David's sin to be imputed onto his son. And because there has to be death, somebody has to die. And in God's justice,
there's a part of me that wants to say it's not fair.
Right?
Okay, so let's remove the fair component, and let's say someone says, well, that feels inconsistent with when God says in Ezekiel, the son shall not bear the guilt of the father.
Right.
Correct.
Nor the father bear the guilt of the son. Because we're not talking, the way at least we're talking about it right now, is not a consequence narrative.
Mm-hmm.
This is a shifting of guilt almost, or bearing of guilt in this picture. Correct. So how is it not a contradiction to what God says in Ezekiel and other passages? Because
you can't, God is not going to punish someone for their father's, mother's sin. So we have to see this in a different view. This is not punishment. This is, again, atonement, and to some degree consequence. Good. So consequence of sin is different than punishment. So when we discipline a child, the moment the goal is to get their behavior to change. The moment their behavior changes, the discipline stops. The discipline has to stop. If you keep disciplining after, then that becomes abuse. And so if their behaviors change, they are a completely different person. It's like, well, I'm sorry, we still have to go through with this discipline. Well, that's not discipline anymore. Now you're abusing the kid. That's different. Punishment is, a price has to be paid for this. And it may or may not relate to what was actually done. But because you did it, the severity of it may change, but you're going to have to bear this penalty. But discipline is that thing that once the behavior is done, once there's remorse and brokenness, and that discipline stops.
But he was remorseful.
He was.
I think a good picture of that is we just mentioned a minute ago that sin has a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Punishment also has a ripple effect. And that's the piece we want to remove. Like we can even accept that sin has a ripple effect because we can, you're a great example of the child and the drugs, but punishment having a ripple effect starts to hit our view of justice versus maybe God's view and our view of fairness in that sense. And we see this essentially in the story of Adam and Eve. The punishment for their sin had a ripple effect to all humanity.
Yeah.
And it's almost so understood that we assume that, but we want that spiritual law, I guess, that spiritual reality of that to cease. But that theme is echoed still in our lives continually throughout Scripture.
I think the reason this happens is maybe just a little bit more simple, and it's in the text. David, in the middle of the story, because remember, he believes Nathan is telling him a story. Mm-hmm. David is a moment away from saying, where did this happen? Was this in Bethlehem? Do I know the people? Nathan is telling the story of the lamb being taken away from the poor family. He is mad. Mm-hmm. And what does he declare? He declares fourfold judgment. He's the king. He declares fourfold judgment on the man who did this. and that he deserves to die.
Yes.
And God accepts David's pronouncement of judgment. He's judging himself. He's putting the pronouncement of judgment on himself.
Okay.
So there is death, but it's a fourfold death because 4 of his sons are going to die. Not only this unnamed child, but 3 other sons are going to die in terrible circumstances, just absolutely terrible circumstances. And David's going to be alive for most of them. I think it might be all of them. I'm not sure.
Okay.
But at least 3 of them he's alive
Jonathan
for.
being one.
No, Jonathan is Saul's son.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Absalom,
Absalom
is one.
Okay.
And and so as we get into next week's message, there's another one that comes up, and there's just so much going on there. So this is proclaimed and this is declared. But let's deal with what's really bothering us in all of this is that God is loving and kind and gracious and compassionate, and
slow to anger and all the things.
Yeah, this doesn't seem like any of those.
No, it doesn't.
And we also have to understand another piece of just Christianity in general, but of following the Lord, and that is the larger role you have, the bigger the ripple that is created when you fall. David is not just a king. It's not a political thing. He is the head of the people of Israel. When he sins, he leads the people of Israel into sin. Because of his sin, the people of Israel become marked with the stain of sin. This is a huge deal. And this is why leaders, pastors, whatever, we have to be above reproach, because even the smallest little bit can steer us into an area where we're going to blow something up that's much bigger than we had envisioned. And it's like, well, so-and-so gets away with this. Other people get away with it. How come I can't get it? You're in a different role. You're in a different position. David's in a different position. That's why we're reading about this.
Yes.
And so the consequences are going to be that much more severe. Let me give also my little aside. And that is that I don't know that growing up in the castle with David in the palace and being one of his sons was exactly a great life. And I think we can say that because God is merciful, that taking this child could be an act of mercy. I don't know that for sure, but not many of his kids turn out well. David is a terrible parent. And I think we've got to say there's a little bit of mercy in this too, instead of this child. So what's better? The kid gets to be 14 and gets slaughtered by a jealous brother or a rival or an enemy or something. Aren't we going to just shake our fist again at God and just say, well, it's not fair? Well, okay. Well, you tell me. What is the age at which it's fair? Is like 75 okay?
Yeah.
Is 80 okay? Like, what's the point where we stop going, I can't believe it. How could God do this? That's us. We have that in our minds. That doesn't have anything to do with what God is doing.
You're also speaking to, and we keep using that phrase where we speak of God and we're saying, hey, but isn't God compassionate and gracious and slow to anger? And we're like, this is contradiction, but it's a great example of picking half the verse and half the story. Because God's character, especially when he's laying out the law to Israel and he says, I am compassionate and gracious, he follows up with, but also the sins that are committed by a first generation will be experienced in the next generation. The next generation will follow them. And so we are that to come back to that verse over and over again is picking half of God's, I don't want to say character, but half of God's story that he wrote for us to understand how he functions and engages with humanity. Now we can say we don't like it or not, or whatever, but at least let's be honest. If we're going to quote the verses, quote the whole thing.
Yep.
What has God truly said?
It's like taking something off the shelf at the grocery store and reading the first 4 ingredients, but not bother to read the rest of what's going on. We like to do that with our God.
Yeah, that's a good picture. I think that's a big hang up in this is we are like, but that's not God.
Okay.
And I would challenge, but well, no, that's not who I think God is. It's not the same as saying that's not God. And we're all wrestle this. I don't fully know God. I'm not going to claim to fully know God, but there's something that when I come into a story like this, and if we've all sat down and probably talked with people, even the answers we're giving right now, all three of us, as we articulate different angles, someone's still listening saying, I still wrestle.
Oh,
Right.
absolutely.
That does. And there's not a way of removing the wrestle
I still wrestle.
without a submission to who God is more than who I am.
Yeah.
That's the only way I find peace in this story and other stories like this, when God doesn't make sense, is a willingness to submit myself to God's character and trust when I can't make sense of it. And I love these discussions, and you know me, I could do this for another 20 minutes, but I think we have to we're going to end this soon, and someone's still going to wrestle. And the only way I know to begin to resolve and find peace is in the trusting of who God is when I don't understand who God is or what he did.
And I think we have a friend in David in that.
Oh, that's
King
good.
David writes about that in the Psalms.
Yes.
I don't get it. I don't know why this is happening, but in God, I can trust you. So final word, we can bring this in for a landing, but my final word on this is, let's be clear why this happened, what the problem was with David, because David is not actually judged for murder. And he's not judged for what he did for to Bathsheba. What he's judged for is what he does to Yahweh. And there are two charges that are made by Nathan to David. And the first one is he despised Yahweh's commands. And the second one is that he treated Yahweh with contempt. Those are the two charges. Not, and God says, hey, you killed Uriah and you took his wife. I saw that. But what's behind it, the problem with it was these two things. You thought Yahweh's commands were optional, or you thought that there was an asterisk next to your name because you're the king, or you just didn't think that they were important enough for you to follow, or you wanted something more than me. And as a result of that, you treated me with contempt. And the one thing we cannot do is, we cannot be contemptuous of our holy God. God puts up with a lot from us, but being contemptuous of him, thumbing our nose at him when we know better in particular, that is dangerous ground.
And you just mentioned a minute ago, we have a partner with David almost in these tensions. And you reminded me a little bit of coming back to just the story of David in this. David did not want his son to die. He, like every parent, he pleaded for God. Like it wasn't that he saw God as doing something wrong. He just saw God, even if what God was doing was still justified, he also understood God's mercy.
Yeah.
He pleaded on behalf of who God was. And that's a side we can partner with David. But the response to after it happens is also something that, even if it's a struggle, we need to move ourselves toward and partnering with David. When he heard of his son's death, it says that he got up, he went to the house of God, and he worshiped.
He mourned in reverse.
He
mourned while the child was sick. And then stopped mourning. Which is exactly opposite of how you do it in that culture. And went to the house of the Lord and praised God. You imagine standing before the throne and knowing that you're responsible.
Right.
Standing before the throne room of God and praising and thanking God and lifting up his name. And
so that contempt for God was turned around in the process.
And I think I think David understood something about worship we don't. Worship can bring healing. It's not the removal of the pain, but worship unites our spirits with God. And when we're in this why God moments of wrestling, when we come before God, and because worship turns our attention away from my need, and it turns my attention to who God is. Worship turns my attention about what's going on in me. And it says, despite what's going on in me, this is who I know God is, and I will celebrate who he is. That we are wired by God's design for worship to be a place of healing and reconciliation with God. And I think a lot of us like, how can I worship a God that does that? And where God is saying, but when you come and worship, you find peace when you can't understand what's happening.
Yeah.
And in that worship, I mean, I know you and I had the privilege of talking to some people yesterday. It is the child running into their father's arms, looking for comfort when life doesn't, when it's hard, when you fall down and you get hurt. So.
And you know, I was in that time we went back and we read 2 Corinthians, where he talks about the God of all comfort, and something I've been sitting with God on the last actually 2 years. I've shared this with Steve a little bit too, is what does it mean to experience God's comfort? And one thing just recently with this story has been realizing one of the ways I experience God's comfort is in worship. It's not just falling to his arms, but it's actually falling to my face and in my allegiance to him and my giving myself over to him, that I actually experience comfort because of his character and who he is.
That's good.
So I'm going to go out on a limb, and I think as we're going to transition to start talking about Solomon here, because Solomon, you know, is the one who is hand chosen by God, hand chosen by David to be his successor. And if we go back to 2 Samuel 7, we are told. Yahweh talks to God or talks to David and says, I'm going to choose a successor. He's going to build my house. You know, all these things. When he does well, I'm going to reward him. When he doesn't, I'm going to punish him. I'm going to be his father, and he's going to be my son. And it's a beautiful picture. But I'm reminded of something as I've been reading that what David wanted was to build the temple. Yeah. That was the desire of his heart. When David tells the prophet, I want to build this house for God, the prophet says, yeah, go ahead and do it. As he's leaving the palace complex, the word of the Lord comes to him and says, no, turn around, go back, tell David not to do it. And one of the things that he says to David is, you want to build a house for me. And there's a little bit of a rebuke in here. How presumptuous of you to assume that I need you to build me a house. I haven't had a house. I will build you a house. That's what I do. God says, I'm going to build up something for you. You don't build something for me. This was going against the idolatry of the day, where we build these little rooms for gods to come down and to visit and then to return to heaven. God is the only one who is with his people. So there's this little bit of as we fast forward to David and to his sin and everything that's going on, he's gotten something wrong about God. And I wonder whether some of that, what he's gotten wrong about God, is maybe carried over and allowed him to be a little presumptuous about God. Well, God, needs me to build him a house. I don't need you to do anything. I'm establishing you. You're not establishing me. I don't need a human being to establish me. And there's a similar rebuke in what he tells, what Nathan tells to David after the sin, is he says, you gotten it wrong, and you have shown contempt for Yahweh. You gotten wrong who he is. You thought he was something he was not. And so again, there's this little interplay of, boy, we get God wrong. And we can't just shrug and say, oh, well, I wasn't right about that. There's danger in getting God wrong and acting on things that we believe to be true when they're not true.
Speaking and declaring who God is, that makes me comfortable. And you alluded to this message, to live the way I want to live.
Yeah.
That's that contempt, because I speak of God for myself. That's that definition where it's about me, but I'm going to invoke his name in order to justify who I want to be and what I think is right and wrong, whether it's in this story or another story. And let's be careful not to say, well, that's what other people are doing. That is a game we all find ourselves playing with God. And the only return from that is, David, I have sinned. I have sinned. And again, come back to that powerful phrase.
Yeah.
So Solomon is David's son. When I think of kings, usually I think of that firstborn son as we're watching what's going on in England. I don't think Solomon is the firstborn son.
He's the fourth-born son of Bathsheba.
Okay.
As far as we know.
Okay, so
maybe fifth-born if we count, the one who died.
Right.
Might be, that's either 4 or 5 in line.
So why was Solomon chosen? Or how was Solomon chosen? I mean,
God.
The why is
God chose him.
Okay.
I mean, that's it.
That's right.
And we don't know. But he was God's chosen instrument, and it was a wise choice because Solomon did well up until towards the end of his life.
Mm-hmm.
And this is actually one of the patterns we're going to see with all of the kings.
Mm-hmm.
But one of David's older sons, Adonijah, sets himself up as king and coronates himself.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Without
throws his own party.
He throws his own party.
Yes.
He just says, "Yeah, no, I'm the king now."
Mm-hmm.
And David is still alive, but he's weak. And it takes Bathsheba and Nathan going to him and saying, "King David, didn't you say that you wanted Solomon to be king? Because Adonijah's moving on his own." So there's a whole thing that happens, and Solomon ends up killing his own brother, Adonijah, because he wants the throne. And it's just a mess. The thing is a mess. So he becomes the second of Adonijah becomes the second of David's sons that's killed. Yeah, there's so much going on.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things we do see in this is the redemptive nature of how God works through our brokenness, through Bathsheba. There's no way Solomon exists apart from Bathsheba.
Right.
And there's no way Bathsheba enters into the picture apart from David's sin.
Right.
And that is
maybe.
Okay. All right. I will.
Yeah.
I do know where you're going with that.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
I mean, and this is what we tell people all the time.
That's
though.
good. No, that's
we're
really,
like, I want
really
this,
good,
I want
Steve.
this, I want this, I want this, and it's like, yeah, but are you forcing the hand of God?
Yeah,
Maybe God wants to give you exactly that.
That's good.
Are you forcing the hand of God by doing this? Because maybe the answer is, I absolutely want that for you. Hang on just a second while I do this other thing. And then we're just out marching. And so it could have been
good.
very well.
I actually do
that David
100%.
wanted Bathsheba and him together, just not in the way it happened.
So-
Yes.
And Uriah could have died. Bathsheba would have been taken in.
Okay.
And maybe, but I'm with you there. I actually like that
totally.
storytelling. And yet the redemptive nature of God saying that his redemptive stories is interwoven in not only our sin, but also interwoven in the consequences of sin.
Yeah.
That's the beauty. Like, that should give us hope.
Yeah.
Solomon's story should be the greatest story of hope that comes out of this, how God's redemptive work for amazing things comes out, is interwoven in consequences of sin.
Yeah. Yeah. God redeems the whole line.
Yeah.
He makes it work. And as we're going to see going forward in the series, David's faithfulness to Yahweh is the thing that is going to lead and be kind of the point of the spear, even when things are going so badly in Israel and in Judah. God is still going to show mercy on the people because of David's faithfulness. And but more on that in a couple weeks.
Okay. Well, I am super excited for your sermon on Sunday where we get to learn more about Solomon. I always have wrestled knowing he started out so well. He was so wise. We see the Queen of Sheba coming to ask him questions. And then he ends up so messy.
Yeah.
And so I don't want that to be me. I want to finish
so
well.
Wise
Yes.
make those kind of decisions.
So I'm hoping there's a good lesson for my life in there. So I'm hoping.
Just hoping.
I'm just hoping.
Me too.
All right. Well, thank you guys. This is fun. And thank you for joining us. Have a great week. Bye-bye.